After the American Revolution was won, and during the period of the Articles of Confederation, the newly independent states faced an identity crisis. While the war had been fought under the banner of liberty, the precise form of government best suited for the new nation remained an open question. Many among the revolutionary generation had been raised under a system that placed the monarch at the center of political life, and while the rhetoric of republicanism had taken hold, certain factions, especially among the political and military elite, harbored doubts about the sustainability of a purely republican system. These doubts, compounded by political instability and economic distress, fueled serious discussions about the possibility of establishing a monarchy in America. The most extraordinary of these discussions culminated in the so-called Prussian scheme, an attempt, real or imagined, to offer the American crown to Prince Henry of Prussia. At the outset of the revolt, American colonists did not universally reject the concept of monarchy. Many, as the anonymous Letters of Junius suggested, distinguished between King George III and his ministers, believing the monarch himself to be a potential ally against an overreaching parliament. One diarist, celebrating the repeal of the Stamp Act, recorded the arrival of the glorious news of the total repeal of the Stamp Act, which was signed by His Majesty King George III of ever glorious memory, which God long preserved and his illustrious house, indicating that at least some believed the king was not the problem, but in fact British Parliament. However, over time, as King George himself became identified with oppressive policies, this loyalty eroded. The rhetoric of Thomas Paine's 1776 pamphlet Common Sense catalyzed a shift in public sentiment, denouncing monarchy as heathenism and hereditary rule as a system that inflicted stupid rulers upon mankind. Despite this growing Republican fervor, doubts about self-governance persisted. Figures like John Adams noted in private letters the disdain that some held for democracy, and others like Dr. Hans, or John in his American name, Joachim Zubli of Georgia, openly declared in the Continental Congress, "A Republican government is little better than a government of devils." The structural weakness of the Articles of Confederation, under which the federal government was rendered nearly impotent, only exacerbated these anxieties. As Shays' rebellion unfolded in Massachusetts, bringing violent unrest to the doorstep of the political elite, many feared that unchecked democracy would bring anarchy. Had any person that was able to protect us come and set up his standard, we should all have flocked to it, even if it had been a monarch, admitted one Massachusetts delegate during the state's ratification debates. With this distress, discussions of monarchy resurfaced during the Continental Congress. As mentioned in my last video about an American king, there was of course the Hamilton Plan, which sought to essentially imbue the power of a monarch into the presidency. Because friend of the channel Lavender and I discussed the Hamilton Plan in deeper detail during that video, I won't be delving into it here. But besides the Hamilton Plan, as we alluded to in that video and in this one, there was a second move to turn the United States into a monarchy around the time of the Constitutional Convention. The basis for this is the historical assertion that Nathaniel Gorham, president of the Convention and formerly of Congress, had written to Prince Henry of Prussia of the House of Hohenzollern in 1786, inviting him to assume the non-existent American throne. This claim, first relayed by President Monroe in a letter to Andrew Jackson, was further corroborated by Senator and former member of the Continental Congress, Rufus King of Massachusetts, in 1824, who recorded in his memoirs that Gorham had indeed sent such a letter, though the document itself has never been found. Monroe suggested that certain leaders of the Federalist Party entertained principles unfriendly to our system of government, that being the Republican government, and that these Federalists meant to work a change in it. According to the tale, General Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, a trusted military leader in both the United States and Prussia, and former officer under the aforementioned Prince Henry during the 7 Years' War, allegedly acted as an intermediary. His response, however, as recalled by his secretary John Mulligan, was dismissive, even antagonistic, wherein he said, "As far as I know about the prince, he would never think of crossing the ocean to be your master. I wrote to him a good while ago regarding what kind of fellows you are. he would not have the patience to stay even 3 days among you. Now that said, only about the late 19th century were uncovered new documents from the Prussian archives that revealed that Prince Henry himself, and not just General Steuben, did indeed respond to an American letter, with Henry expressing surprise at the idea that the United States might abandon its republican principles. He acknowledged that if America collectively chose to adopt a system modeled on England's, it would be, quote, the most perfect among all, though he suggested that a French candidate would be better suited due to the alliance between the Americans and the French. Now, this event, the Prussian scheme, was never recorded during the Constitutional Convention, nor, of course, did Prince Henry actually assume the throne in the United States, otherwise we'd be living in a very different world. The idea, of course, collapsed primarily because of 3 obvious factors. The entrenched Republican ideology among the broader populace by this point, several years after the Revolution had already ended, the rapid convening and urgent pace of the Constitutional Convention of 1787, and the sheer improbability of convincing a European prince to come overseas and take the American throne. Even among those like John Adams, who doubted pure republicanism, the idea of an outright monarchy was politically untenable. Washington, writing to Officer Louis Nicola in 1782, had already condemned any suggestion of monarchy as, quote, big with the greatest mischiefs that can befall my country. John Jay, on the other hand, warned that continued instability might drive people toward tyranny, explicitly in favor of a stronger federal government to prevent the need for a monarchy. Even the aforementioned Hamilton, a proponent of strong centralized authority, ultimately dismissed monarchy within the United States at the time, stating at the Constitutional Convention that, quote, the mind of the American people was so thoroughly Republican that the idea of introducing monarchy would be an idle dream. To hammer the nail in the coffin even more, by the time Prince Henry's supposed response could have reached America, the Constitutional Convention had assembled in Philadelphia, and Gorham thus had no reason to really follow through with his appeals to Henry, as solutions to the problem of instability were being thought of in real time. While the Prussian scheme ultimately amounted to nothing more than an extraordinary historical footnote, its mere consideration does speak volumes about the fragility of early American government. Figures like Gorham and Steuben, despite their service to the Revolution, momentarily had to entertain the notion that order might be best secured through monarchy, simply because of how chaotic these early years under the failing Articles of Confederation had been. As Washington himself warned, even respectable Republican figures who spoke of monarchy, quote, without horror, might soon find themselves acting upon such thoughts. Ultimately, however, republicanism, of course, prevailed. By codifying a presidency with strong yet limited powers, the Constitution served as a compromise between those who feared anarchy and those who feared kingship. But what if that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, somehow the Prussian scheme actually worked? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help support our content, you can watch through our extensive catalog of videos, or consider joining the channel, like our first and current member, Eaglefall. You can also submit a scenario in our official Discord server, linked below. Anyway, thanks, and enjoy the video. To begin, there are a few factors we need to work out in order that the Prussian scheme can be followed through with. Let's say, for the sake of the scenario, the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation plunged the United States into prolonged civil disorder and incessant riots. Already in our own history, the disturbances created by the shortcomings of the Articles reportedly, quote, gave rise to a class of men in the community who gave very serious apprehensions to the advocates for a republican form of government. Essentially, some within the American upper classes began to consider at least a Roman form of dictatorship, if not absolute monarchy, in response to the civil unrest. And we're going to assume the Articles of Confederation just fail even harder than they did in our own history, leading to even more widespread revolts, some even on the same scale as Shays' Rebellion. And with that, any American elite who had thus far entertained more federalist views or were not even explicitly opposed to monarchical or English institutions would be pushed even further to that degree in response to this Republican terror. The crisis of self-governance would reach such extremes that George Washington, then the unchallenged symbol of American virtue and the Revolution, would be beckoned to take power and restore order. Yet for the sake of our scenario, we'll have him refuse. By this point, other leaders would move swiftly to secure a more authoritarian remedy. This would be the environment in which the Prussian scheme would find fertile ground. Letters exchanged in Philadelphian circles would reveal that figures like John Adams, though publicly extolling the virtues of republicanism, privately confided in trusted friends that, quote, "the masses are ungovernable in this climate, and a strong hand is required to steady the rudder." In the autumn of 1786, with disorder escalating in the streets of Boston and Philadelphia, Nathaniel Gorham, president of the Continental Convention, secretly dispatched a letter to Prince Henry of Prussia, drawing upon a tradition of enlightened absolutism emerging in parts of Europe. The letter implored Prince Henry to take the crown of the United States and restore order to the continent. Gorham's epistle, though couched in the polite formalities of transatlantic diplomacy, carried with it an urgency, a call for a savior to rescue the United States from the abyss of self-inflicted turmoil. Henry would initially see the offer as laughable. However, with reports pouring in by way of English and French trade ships of the terror of the Americas, he would quickly come to realize that this was a serious overture. At the Reinsberg Palace, Henry would summon his most trusted advisors to deliberate over the implications of Gorham's letter. Among the confidants was Count Friedrich Adolf von Kalkreuth, who had long served the prince in battle. Yet even as Henry mulled over the offer, a more decisive counsel beckoned from a source far closer to the epicenter of Prussian power. Prince Henry was summoned by his elder brother, King Frederick II, Frederick the Great, a monarch whose effectiveness in ruling was matched only by his disdain for the British Empire. Frederick and Prussia more broadly were still antagonistic with Britain due to their perceived betrayal in the 7 Years' War. Frederick, who had intercepted the letter prior to its arrival in Henry's hands, saw in the Americans an opportunity for Prussia to exact a measure of retribution against the British and to spread their influence across the Atlantic. Frederick had become aware that the Americans had begun circulating not only Prince Henry's name, but even that of a British prince, Frederick Duke of York and Albany, as a monarch. These rumors were not without substantiation. An author from Philadelphia wrote at the time, so acute were they that the convention issued a public denial that any proposal for a reestablishment of a monarchy was not being considered, which was later corroborated in a letter sent by Alexander Martin to the new governor of California who had succeeded him. In Prussia, Frederick pressed upon his younger brother the notion that by accepting the crown of the United States, Henry could serve as a massive instrument of Prussian power, something that sincerely touched upon a nerve. Henry had always hoped to be more instrumental in Prussian affairs, evident in his writings after the death of Frederick the Great. And so, with this mightily ordained task, Henry would pen his reply to the Americans. "I accept," he wrote, "not merely as a bearer of Prussian honor, but as a humble servant, called upon by fate to restore order and hope to a nation beset by chaos. Let it be known that I assume this mantle not for personal glory, but to reforge a bond between Europe and the New World, a union that shall serve as a bulwark against tyranny and a testament to enlightened governance." Evidently, he knew how to preach to the choir. We'll go forward under the assumption that somehow Prince Henry is crowned the King of the United States, and that this action in and of itself doesn't result in the immediate dissolution of the country and a massive civil war. Obviously, it's not realistic, but nonetheless, we'll be acting under this premise. The news of Prince Henry's acceptance would come as a major surprise to the British. This would spark a debate in the House of Parliament, among the King's Advisory Council, and in the aristocracy, as to whether or not such a decision was beneficial or downright offensive to the British Empire. On one hand, it presented an opportunity to sever the ties between the United States and France, given the Franco-Prussian rivalry which manifested after the 7 Years' War. However, it was also a direct affront to the British monarchy and deeply disgracing. On top of that, it also threatened the economic hold Britain might secure over the United States following their independence. Britain, regardless of the ties between their nations, was unequivocally the foremost trade partner to the United States, even as they continued to squabble in the aftermath of the Revolution. If this Prussian king brought the United States closer to Prussia proper and began to tariff or even halt British trade in favor of Prussian trade. This would harm Britain's economic stranglehold over North America, and also give Prussia a means to develop a quasi-internal market which may propel it to rival Britain more thoroughly in the coming years. Now, across the Channel in France, the reaction would be markedly different. While many in Paris decried what might seem to be the loss of an ally in the United States, and while French Republicans, who were greatly growing in size at this point, saw the change as a betrayal to the revolutionary virtues, certain French intellectuals and statesmen would see in this a political opportunity. Some even argue that a Prussian-ruled America might actually serve as a counterbalance to British power on the high seas. The French monarchy thus maintained a very wary neutrality towards the matter, admitting that the new order in America might yield unforeseen advantages, yet it would of course remain a matter to be observed. Within America itself, the reaction was of course sharply divided along ideological lines. Federalists, whose ranks included not only former revolutionaries but also merchants and landowners, generally hailed the arrival of a foreign restorer of order. They saw in Prince Henry a figure capable of uniting the nigh independent states under a banner of stability and progress. Federalist pamphlets began to appear, arguing that in the darkest hours of our national existence, it is better to accept the benevolence of enlightened despotism than to risk the ruin that unfettered democracy pretends. Conversely, the anti-federalists, defenders of the autonomy of the states and skeptics of any concentration of power, even one that promised stability, rejected the notion vehemently. Figures such as that of Patrick Henry and other ardent advocates of decentralization decried the abandonment of liberty for the, quote, mirage of order. Now, in this period, we might ask where the ever-important George Washington stands on the matter. Some contemporaries would certainly have implored him to save the nation, believing that his leadership might avert the need for foreign intervention altogether. Washington's infrequent public statements during this period, according to some, reaffirmed this belief of his that a nation must rise on its own virtues and must not be sustained by the crutch of a crown. Privately, though, correspondence unearthed in later years would reveal his measured horror at the unrest that plagued Republican America. George Washington was never one to abandon the nation he had led into independence. However, with the ascension of a Prussian to the throne, one who was a contemporary of a very trusted friend, was better, in his mind, than the possibility that he himself would be thrust into absolute power and tarnish his own legacy. In this way, Washington could remain a hero of the American Revolution and peacefully carry on with the later years of his life in Mount Vernon. Now, Henry, in preparation to accept the position, would actually contact General Washington over the course of a series of letters and correspondences. Henry implored Washington to return to his generalship in order to legitimize Henry's rule in the eyes of the American people, but Washington refused. The general simply requested that trusted confidants of his own be inserted in close proximity to the new ruler, that the United States might be governed by those who knew her closest. Among these confidants were John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, the General Henry Knox, who would become Prince Henry's foremost general in the coming years, and James Madison, among others. Upon Henry's acceptance of the American crown, King Henry embarked on a carefully orchestrated campaign to restore order and reconfigure the government along lines that blended European monarchical traditions with the revolutionary spirit of America. Publicly, Henry framed himself not unlike Frederick the Great, as an enlightened despot. His inaugural address of sorts, delivered from the site of Fairmount Park in Philadelphia, wherein a new American palace was under construction, promised to reforge a nation where stability and liberty might walk hand in hand. King Henry, along with Adams, Madison, Hamilton, and a series of Prussian and American advisors which he brought from the court, would get to work restructuring the United States and drafting a new constitution. This new constitution would inevitably take a heavy federalist tilt, establishing a strong government in the capital of Philadelphia, with vast powers to decisively act against rebellion, along with the creation of a standing national army led by Generals Knox and Calcraft. Henry would, in order to maintain goodwill with the Americans, establish a parliament, a divergence from his brother Frederick the Great, who was an absolute monarch. Embedded within the Constitution, however, would be a set of powers allowing the monarchy to easily override Parliament in times of crisis. A national currency would be established, nullifying the state currencies that had become commonplace during the Articles of Confederation, and a meritocratic bureaucracy which would answer to both Parliament and the king. This meritocracy would become, in Henry's view, the precursor to a truly effective, enlightened American aristocracy, not unlike the vision of John Adams. The Constitution would codify intellectual freedoms and freedoms of the press and publication, land rights for citizens, rights against the quartering of soldiers in private homes, and rights to trial, among others. This would come at the behest of James Madison, who continually attempted to remind his counterparts of the threat that Republican uprisings would bring to their new government if they could not be appeased. Henry's first order of business would be the construction of monuments in every major city, which would display the Constitution in public, not unlike the legal traditions of the ancient Romans. For Prussia, this American crown represented a remarkable extension of its influence. By securing what was effectively a foothold in the New World, King Henry hoped to advance the broader strategic interests of the Prussian state, and his prestige within it. The new American monarchy would thus quickly forge economic and military alliances that favored Prussian trade and security interests. Trade agreements were renegotiated to open American markets to Prussian goods, and joint military exercises were conducted as a means of integrating the American defense capabilities with Prussian military doctrine, and opening up the Prussians to the naval opportunities that the maritime states brought. The already established mercantile and naval class in America, and I cannot stress this enough, would actually become one of the most precious and crucial acquisitions in this agreement for the Prussians, as it would allow them to begin to expand their ability to project power at sea, both from Europe and also from America into the Atlantic Ocean. However, the situation was not all peaches and strawberries. Inevitably, this was going to result in fierce pushback from some in the United States. The fervor of the anti-federalists, already simmering with distrust for this centralized authority, soon would of course ignite into open revolt. In cities like Charleston and New York, crowds would take to the streets, violent skirmishes would break out in marketplaces and taverns, and the rural highlands of Appalachia and Vermont would become a hotbed for militias preparing to fight back against the supposed tyranny of King Henry. The firm hand of the state, however, was not to be challenged for long. Under Henry's command, the emerging American standing army, trained in the precise, regimented, structured methods of Prussian warfare, rapidly suppressed these internal uprisings. But there was also a significant threat from the northwest, that of the Indian tribes, many of whom had found themselves recently emboldened by British support. Generals Henry Knox and Count Friedrich von Kelkreuth led disciplined battalions against the Indians, while small regiments suppressed rebellions in the cities. Knox was set to lead a campaign against the hostilities erupting in the Ohio frontier. He was to protect American settlements like the Detroit outpost. But as battle was occurring against the rebels and the hostile Indians, Henry would actually adopt a very interesting policy towards the Indians. His view towards the Indians, or the Native Americans, was not one of outright suppression, but of negotiation, not unlike the broader European view of the British, Dutch, and French towards the natives. Drawing upon a Prussian intellectual fascination, what later German scholars would term Indian enthusiasm, the king wanted to protect these Indian tribes, which he viewed through a highly romanticized and Prussian lens. Under his direction, negotiations would thus commence while Henry was fighting the hostile tribes with the confederacies of peaceful tribes in the Great Lakes region. King Henry wanted to establish essentially an Indian confederation in which tribal leaders would be recognized as sovereign allies of the crown and serve as a buffer between the British in Canada and the Prussians and Americans in the United States. Treaties were thus drawn up that allowed for certain land rights for indigenous peoples and, in return, secured their loyalty against other Indian bands incited by British agitators, as well as protecting certain highly important American outposts along the Great Lakes, like Detroit. I would imagine that perhaps over time, this would lead to the emergence of a distinctive class of Europeanized Amerindians, leaders and merchants who spoke German and English, who engaged in trade with the Americans and perhaps even captained merchant vessels bound for Europe or Africa. Though they might not necessarily be socially equal for a period of time, these native confederacies would enjoy significant economic parity with the Americans. And they would also serve to assist the Americans in battle against the hostile Indians. But around this time, something else would happen. Henry would be faced with his own passing. In our own history, Henry did not have any children with his wife, Princess Wilhelmina of Hesse-Kassel, before his death. This has been credited to his open homosexuality by modern historians. And yes, this would mean that the first King of America would be gay. Regardless, I believe it's not out of the question that when faced with the necessity for secession in America, Henry would undoubtedly have children early on in his reign, as despite his lifestyle, he would nonetheless understand the pragmatic reality of secession, and furthermore, his sense of self-aggrandizement, again sourced from his letters after the death of Frederick the Great, would compel him to do what he could to ensure his legacy continued. In our own history, there was no pragmatic necessity for him to continue his legacy, but in this timeline there is. So we'll assume for the sake of the scenario that Henry has at least one son to whom the throne is passed on to. About 5 years after Henry's death, his son, who we'll simply call Henry II for continuity, would have to deal with a major crisis. In 1807, the abolition of serfdom in Prussia signalized a broader ideological shift against slavery and towards economic modernization and industrialization, and this reform, celebrated in Prussia as a progressive triumph, would undoubtedly become a topic of discussion in Philadelphia. Yet the adoption of a similar amendment in America, a move that would grant greater freedom to formerly subjugated agricultural laborers in the form of the black slaves, would provoke fierce reactions. By 1808, an official decree abolishing slavery in the United States would be passed, and in several southern states where agrarian elites were the ruling oligarchy, the response would become violent. The American generals were still dealing with rebellions in certain rural regions, and by the early 1810s, what had begun all those years ago during the reign of Henry I as isolated disturbances would burgeon into a full-fledged civil conflict. The insurgents, calling themselves the Confederation of Liberty, would stage a series of coordinated rebellions across the agrarian heartland. They believed that if the monarchy wanted to get rid of their way of life, that they ought to secede entirely, a spiritual successor to the American Revolution against tyranny. In response, Henry II would mobilize the full might of the Prussian-style standing army. General Benjamin Lincoln of Massachusetts, no relation, among others, would be sent to fight the rebels. The American army, moderately seasoned in both internal suppression and frontier warfare with those previous rebellions under Henry I, would thus lead a rapid deployment force that moved from the coastal cities into the interior. General Winfield Scott of Virginia would lead the rebel forces near the banks of the Mississippi in what would later be known as the Battle of the Verdant Fields. The American army found easy victory here, though Pyrrhic in its human toll. General Benjamin Lincoln's forces would continue through Kentucky towards Nashville and then further into the Mississippi Territory while the Navy blockaded the coast. A second division was sent to Charlotte after having reclaimed Richmond. The rebels were quickly then disposed of in a decisive defeat, simply unable to match the discipline of the American standing army. In the aftermath, King Henry II instituted a handful of amendments aimed at placating the lingering discontent, while preserving the integrity of the United States. A small series of provisions that protected the economic interests of the agrarian sectors were intended to forestall further insurrection, though this rebellion would have not been the only one occurring in the early 1800s. Across the ocean, in 1789, the French Revolution had begun, after which the Reign of Terror occurred and then the coup of 18 Brumaire, wherein Napoleon Bonaparte became first consul. The Prussians in Prussia proper had been watching these events with great fright. Frederick William II's reign had, in many respects, revealed the vulnerabilities of the state when confronted with the forces of revolutionary France. Despite earlier expansions in the 7 Years' War, during this period the Prussians tried to remain neutral out of defensive caution as the Austrians and Italians were falling under Napoleon's ire, much as they had upon joining the League of Armed Neutrality in the late 18th century. The result was then a reluctant Prussian acquiescence, culminating in the Peace of Basel in 1795. However, Napoleon Bonaparte's sheer ambition and power over continental Europe soon forced the Prussian court to confront the French threat. Frederick William III, ascending to the throne in 1797, was thrust into a changing European order. In 1806, after the crushing defeat of Prussian forces at the Battle of Jena, the Old World had effectively collapsed under the weight of French military might. The Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 forced Prussia to cede vast swaths of territory, lands west of the Elbe, and regions gained under previous partitions of Poland in exchange for a humiliating financial tribute and a measure of French oversight. During this time, the Americans were busy fighting that civil war in their homeland, and thus Prussia could not rely on military aid from across the sea, which might, for now, have been unhindered by the similarly anti-Napoleon British. This period of subjugation, however, sowed the seeds for profound internal reform. Within Prussia's beleaguered administration, visionaries soon emerged. Karl Stein and later Karl August, first von Hartenberg, embarked upon a sweeping program of military, administrative, and social reforms aimed at rejuvenating the state against French tyranny. As Napoleon's campaigns raged, Prussia's fortunes began to reverse. The reformed army, now infused with the innovative doctrines of Gerhard von Scharnhorst, and later refined under the leadership of von Blücher, played a pivotal role in the War of Liberation from 1813 to 1814. The tide then turned at the Battle of Leipzig, and the subsequent invasion of France proper heralded the eventual downfall of Napoleon at the hands of the Prussians and the British. Then at the Congress of Vienna, the victors redrew the map of Europe. Even in spite of their formerly poor relations, especially due to the North American issue, Britain rewarded Prussia with significant territorial acquisitions from the merged provinces of Saxony-Westphalia and Pomerania to the strategic lands west of the Rhine, thereby allowing Prussia to emerge in the coming years as the sole great power among the northern Germans. With its expanded territory and enhanced prestige following the Vienna Congress, Prussia found itself uniquely positioned to challenge the traditional dominance of Austria within the German Confederation. The rise of a formidable Prussian state, now with a solidified transatlantic market and alliance with an American monarchy that had inherited the disciplined structures of Prussian infantry while innovating a new American navy derivative of that of the English, essentially set the Prussians up for either consolidation of power among the German peoples and kingdoms, or the ability to join the colonial race before the majority of the world's territory had already been taken by the French, the British, the Dutch, the Portuguese, and the Spanish. As trade and naval cooperation between America and Prussia deepened throughout the early half of the 19th century, the industrialization which was consuming the United States would be exported to Prussia. I didn't mention the Louisiana Purchase before, because there was a lot going on with the Civil War in the United States and also the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, but it is likely that Napoleon wouldn't sell Louisiana to the Americans, and yet they would nonetheless end up with it after the fall of the French Empire, simply due to the sheer amount of American settlers who had begun venturing west during these times. With the industrialization of North America and new and reinvigorated Prussian resolve to take power, joint ventures would soon begin to colonize distant lands in Asia and Africa. The mercantile prowess of the already well-entrenched American merchant fleets would enable the establishment of companies both in Prussia and America, which could then venture into Africa and Asia for resources, spices, and territories with which to create outposts, much as the French and Portuguese had done, and also the Dutch to a greater degree. Faced with well-entrenched European powers along the Indian coasts in the British, French, and Portuguese, these ventures would not seek to engage directly in a head-on contest for territory. Prussia was, after all, constrained by the North Sea and thus could not encroach upon British claims without being easily cut off from their colonies. One solution would of course be to dock Prussian ships in friendly American ports, but this was unsustainable if a British blockade were to last for an extended period of time. Instead, to avoid the problem altogether, they would turn their attention to regions where the competition was less congested, and where local power structures allowed for an easy negotiated entry. The Malay Peninsula and the island of Borneo, with their abundant natural resources and maritime positions, would become logical targets for the Prussians and their American counterparts. In these parts of Southeast Asia, spice companies would do as their European counterparts had and make treaties with the natives, establish outposts and ports, and begin to exploit the resources of the colonies, beating the British and Dutch to the punch. Simultaneously, they would establish a series of satellite outposts along West Africa's Atlantic seaboard, tapping into lucrative commerce in gold, ivory, and other natural resources, while also creating a line of friendly ports which would allow ships to travel from Prussia to America to West Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, into the Indian Ocean, and to their Southeast Asian outposts. On a cultural level, the transatlantic bond between Prussia and the United States had also fostered a gradual synthesis of the German and English languages among the ruling and educated classes. In Philadelphia, a city that had quickly become the center of royal governance under King Henry I and, of course, his successor, King Henry II, a new American language would be standardized and published, known as Amerikaans, which would essentially synthesize English and German. As an aside, in our own history, there is an urban legend called the Muhlenberg legend, which states that the single vote of Frederick Muhlenberg, the first ever Speaker of the House of Representatives, prevented German from becoming an official language of the United States. So in our alternate timeline, I'd bet Muhlenberg wouldn't be too happy, though he'd also be dead by this point. Regardless, as we exit the first half of the 19th century and rear ever closer towards the era of Bismarck, the world will have been transformed in an almost unimaginable way. The industrial engines of North America, of course, roared to life, and merchants and legions of a reformed Prussia extended their reach into Southeast Asia and West Africa. Yet, with the rise of one power comes the inevitable fear from an established one. The politicians and statesmen of London and Vienna began to fear that the concert of Europe established by the Vienna Congress was now under threat, and that Metternich's vision was to be uprooted by the Prussians and their thirst for expansion. With the rising tide of nationalist fervor in the German states, manifest destiny manifesting itself in the American Great Plains, and the ever-present threat of the mighty British Empire, who was ever watching these German powers to ensure they could not overtake them, Prussia and America were not in for a completely smooth ride in the coming years. Unbeknownst to anyone, however, the clock was ticking closer to the year 1848, while the merchants, soldiers, farmers, and statesmen of Europe and America were none the wiser. And that's where I'll be ending this scenario for today. As always, let me know what you think will happen next. And if you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with a join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the Use of Z, signing out.